My name is John A. O'Neill. I grew up in Paradise, California, which has been in the news lately.
Do you come from a military family? And did any of your siblings serve? Did your father serve?
Yes, I come from a very military family. I was born in September of 1941 at Fort Lewis, Washington, to First Lieutenant John O'Neill and Viola O'Neill of the 15th Infantry. My father served during World War II, but I'm into genealogy in a big way. I did not know my father as an adult. So in looking back at his papers, discovered that he never served overseas in World War II. He was an high school ROTC teacher at two high schools as a captain in the Army. Subsequent to that, we had a variety of postings in Fort Francis E. Warren, Wyoming, got to think of Fort Sam Houston, and then Presidio, San Francisco, where he retired.
And so, could you tell me a little bit about so you had this background in your family had a background in the military, and so you decided to volunteer? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Now, the dean of Chico State College, suggested that I might want to take a year off. And so I went down to the recruiter with the background in the Army, and he could not guarantee me a position in the Corps of Engineers, I was an engineering student. So he suggested the Intelligence Corps, which turned out to be really a great assignment.
And so you joined the Intelligence Corps, and that this is out of college?
Correct. I had 3 years of college when I joined the Army and was assigned to the Intelligence Corps.
And so what? And this is 1965. Would that be correct?
1964, June of 1964, I was inducted and did basic training at Fort Ord, California.
And so, after basic training, what was that? What was the assignment process like for you? Were you initially signed domestically, or were you sent to Vietnam right away? What was that process?
No, I knew that I was going to go to AIT, which is Advanced Individual Training, at Fort Holabird, Maryland, which was the intelligence headquarters for the Army at the time. I knew that I was going to be trained as counterintelligence investigator. Went through that course, and after that course, I was assigned to Indianapolis, more favorably known as Indian No Place.
So why was
Come
that?
on, I was 23 years old. I was a bachelor.
So it was very boring, you're saying?
It was very boring. So I volunteered to go to Korea. That was denied. There was a war going on in Vietnam. I had to think about it. But my Japanese NCO, non-commissioned officer buddy at the office at Fort Benjamin Harrison said, let's go to Vietnam. So we volunteered for Vietnam, and both of us got accepted to go to Vietnam. And I went to Vietnam. I preceded the group the buildup, and that was helpful to me in finding a place to go. I was given several opportunities, and I chose the Delta, the Mekong Delta, because there was less military activity there. I'm a warrior, but I really didn't want to go out into the jungle, so I was sent to the Mekong Delta, Can Tho, and I had no cultural training. I had no language training. So the only thing that I was really qualified to do, which is what I was trained to do, and that was to do background investigations to determine the ability and the need for soldiers with background investigations. My role, because I had no language training primarily, was simply to do background investigations on soldiers stationed in the Four Corps, Mekong Delta area, go out and determine if they were acceptable candidates for security clearances.
And these soldiers you were talking about were South Vietnamese Army?
No, these were American. I only spoke English. I had no language capability, and the only thing I was doing was personnel investigations for American soldiers.
And so during this, what was the goal of these investigations? What were you trying to learn about the other U.S. soldiers?
Whether they were true patriots and had nothing in the background that would preclude them from having a security clearance of confidential security and top security.
In your little excerpt you sent me, who could you talk a little bit about the translator you met in South Vietnam?
As a matter of fact, once again, I went from No Place, Indiana, a boring place, to Can Tho, South Vietnam, and again, there was no activity there. So I did the minimal amount of personnel background investigations and had a lot of time to do other things. Our translator in our unit was a 20-year-old, when I got there, 20-year-old Vietnamese kid, and I was 23 years old, and we were buddies, and I got to know him and his family very well, and I spent a great deal of time with the translator and his family in the public setting in Can Tho, Vietnam. I was not uniformed. I was in civilian clothes for the 1 year that I was there, and that allowed me to move around in the community with no one watching me, if you will. And I had a great association with many civilians there.
Your friendship with this translator allowed you to interact, you would say, with the local population very much.
Correct. The translator was Tang Bao Can. His father was Tang Sing. Tang Sing brought his family down from Hanoi in a about 1963 because he was a banker and a businessman. He did not want to be involved with the communist government. His brother stayed in the North. The family settled in Cần Thơ, and the father, Tang Sing, was employed, but he was an entrepreneur. And everyone knew that the Americans, if you will, were going to win, so they wanted to learn English. Tang Sing and his family started English classes that were held every evening. There were two classes per individual every evening, and I went there to have conversation with the students that were there, trying to learn English because they knew that the U.S. participation was going to be victorious.
So that was the widespread belief. There was no question it was going to be an American victory.
Correct. The participation on my part was for conversation, simply to hold conversation with the students. Now, the students were from 6 to 60. I remember a major that was in these classes, and there were many high school students. I became friends with the Big Mouth Club. The Big Mouth Club was a group of teenagers, like teenagers everywhere, who were in fact learning English and having a good time, being teenagers in a in an absolutely non-combat zone. We were able to do anything and everything in the community of Cần Thơ. I palled around with this Big Mouth Club. I went to their high school and was chastised by their principal because I was an adult and I had not introduced myself. But this group just had a good time learning English and doing teenage boy things. And subsequently, which we'll probably get into, I had contact with several of them who were able to escape to the United States and became very successful people.
So you were able to befriend all these people, you would say, through your interactions with the civilian population, which is definitely would you say that's unique for most personnel, American personnel in Vietnam?
No, it's not unique. Hopefully, Matthew, as you do your interviews, you will discover that American military are very involved when they can be with the local populace. I don't know that it's a unique American thing, but it very much is a thing with the American military that they will seek out and befriend those people that are caught up in the conflict.
Right. So there was a real effort, you'd say, by the military to interact with the population and not just ignored.
It's not by the military, it's by the individual. Americans are very friendly people.
So there's the individual dedicated effort to do this.
Absolutely.
I come from New York, so that's difficult for me when you see people on the street. ignoring other people. It's hard to imagine that they're very very caring on a foreign setting like that for the locals.
That's interesting that you say that because I've had experience in New York, and you're absolutely right. You don't make eye contact. If you make eye contact, that means you want to have some interaction. It may be because there are too many people, but no, when you get in a smaller setting, it's very easy to say, hey, what's up?
Absolutely. So you also mentioned in the excerpt that you had an interaction with a soldier from South Vietnam that you befriended.
Because I was in civilian status, I had a civilian apartment, and when I came down from the apartment, the RVN, Republic of Vietnam, had posted a guard. And there was a young guard there that, because everybody knew that with the United States involved, you wanted to learn English. He approached me and spoke with me, and we became friends. He had been drafted into the RVN, Republic of Vietnam Army, and had been a grammar school teacher, elementary school teacher, and simply wanted to have somebody to have a conversation with.
Right.
He had been recently married, and he and his wife lived in a little hut, which was typical. And we simply became friends and became lasting friends after Vietnam.
So it sounds like your experience at living in Vietnam was very positive. It sounds like you met a lot of very friendly people.
Very positive. I have 14 ancestors that fought for the Union in the Civil War. This was a civil war. Now, you can't compare it to the American Civil War. There were those who did not want to live under a communist government. There's a lot of expanded history there. But these particular people wanted to have a free government. And this fellow was one of them. And he simply wanted to get back into the system with a great knowledge of English. And we continued our relationship far beyond my service for the 1 year in Vietnam.
And so why did you return? Did the Army assign you back in domestically, or what was that process?
Yes, I was assigned back domestically to the intelligence school and spent my last 6 months at the intelligence school.
And so, it's interesting because this was a time that that many more Americans were going to Vietnam, but you were actually already returning from Vietnam. So, like you said, you preceded everyone, I guess, or the majority.
I had great memories of my friends in Vietnam. I searched for them as Vietnam fell, if you will. I was able to locate the translator who suffered grievously with the fall of Vietnam because he worked for American intelligence and RVN, Republic of Vietnam Intelligence. He spent 7 years in re-education camps, brutal re-education camps. He was freed. He could not get a job. He was able to escape from Vietnam by a boat. And in that boat, on the Gulf of Thailand, the pirates found him and his family who was on the boat. The family was his wife, the girlfriend that I knew in Vietnam, and his son and his daughter. The method of moving any kind of wealth was either gold or diamonds. The pirates took the gold and diamonds and the daughter.
How old was the daughter at the time?
8 or 9 years old.
And so, what was the destination of your friend, the translator there? Where was he trying to go on the boat?
Thailand, for the most part.
And
that's where he ended up.
So he was robbed on the boat, and his daughter was kidnapped, and then he ended up in Thailand. And what happened after there for him?
They spent time in the refugee camps in Thailand, and eventually that whole family, the Tang family, was able to come to the U.S.
And you had contact with him at this point?
You've got to understand that I'm a counterintelligence investigator. I was able to find his brother and his sister in Michigan originally. And then I found him. Then I found the whole family. Yes, the whole family was able to come through the system and get to the United States. These are the people from the tropical area that end up in Michigan.
Exactly,
but
that's
they all
polar opposite.
Congregated in Little Saigon in the Los Angeles area.
And so this was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, you would say?
Late 1970s.
And you had contact with him. So did you meet up with him after this, at this point?
Absolutely. That's my brother. He looked at me as big brother, and he was my little brother.
You mentioned in the excerpt you sent me, you mentioned that you had actually you had 2 children of your own, biological, and you adopted 2 children?
We were ZPG. Now, Matthew Pollack might not know about ZPG, zero population growth. 2 biological children, that's all. We wanted more kids. So we came into a situation where a Vietnamese male, 11-year-old, I guess he was, actually probably about 13, needed a place to stay. So he came to live with us. And subsequently, his cousin was due to come to the U.S. as a refugee and go to New York, where she would go into the Chinese community and simply be another food worker there. He asked the foster son, asked us if we could have the cousin come and live with us, which he did. And so we ended up with 2 sponsored foster children.
And these foster children were right from Vietnam, or they came to the U.S. first, or what? I'm not familiar with the program, so.
No, they go through the refugee process. There's currently some concern by some about how refugees get to the United States. A very difficult path to follow. Very well documented, researched. The people that come are in fact very valid refugees who need a place to be in the U.S. The foster son is very close to the biological kids, and he's just another kid.
And so you're very connect. I mean, your whole life seems to be very connected with Vietnam. You served in Vietnam, and you raised basically you raised Vietnamese children, and so this is it seems like a very almost I don't know if it'd be fair to say a very positive part of your life was that time.
A very positive part, and we've all been back to Vietnam. My biological children were just fascinated with our trip when we went back to the foster son's wedding, and we saw all the places that I had been and just experienced the culture of Vietnam to the nth degree.
And would you say it's changed a lot since you were there?
Yes, certainly it has changed a lot. When we were there in the 90s for the foster son's wedding, there was a great deal of development and construction in the international community. Everybody wanted to be there. The interesting thing is, to my limited knowledge, that entrepreneurial activity has not taken place in North Vietnam, only because they were not exposed to it. Now they're getting exposed to it now, and that will change. But Vietnam is a very vibrant economic community.
And so, could I ask you what your so I think your experience with the war, and you were never in combat, but afterwards coming home, you mentioned that when you were there was a prevailing feeling of certain American victory. So do you think when did that ever start to change with you, if it ever did?
Oh, it did. Certainly with the fall of Saigon, of Vietnam, and the takeover of a communist government was disappointing to an awful lot of veterans that were there. Now, they went through the creation of, if you will, a communist government that has now relaxed somewhat with a recognition that private enterprise can, as demonstrated in South Vietnam, really do a lot. This has not taken place in North Vietnam to the best of my knowledge. The attitude and the learning just is not there that these things can build. Obviously, North Vietnam has come into the 21st century, but not as rapidly as South Vietnam.
You told me in the beginning of the email you sent me that you were promoting people telling their stories, so about their experience. So when did this come about?
Well, there are two things. My personal situation is very positive. I had a very good experience in Vietnam. I did not have any battle activity. The battle activity that took place was very violent, as war is, and certainly a waste of people, of resources. I do promote the people that were in Vietnam talking about Vietnam, both for their good and for the good of the general public. I'm very involved with the Civil War for a number of reasons. And I've come to the conclusion that the only way that slavery could have been abolished in the United States was with a war. I work with a number of Quakers in our neighborhood here who are appalled with that. But my conclusion is the only way that could have happened was with a war. I would have thought that you would be able to sit down and talk it over and say, no, this is what we have to do. But my conclusion is that war was the only way to stop slavery in the United States.
Do you think that was a justified choice, you would say, for the U.S. to get involved in Vietnam?
A very difficult choice. But it was a civil war. And I do know those people who were rooting for the non-communist government in spite of the problems with the Republic of Vietnam government leadership. Terrible. But yes, I think it was justified in halting communism's forward movement. I would hope that it could have been avoided, but it wasn't, and I think the outcome was satisfactory.
Well, I've exhausted my list of questions, and it's really interesting to hear your story and to hear it in more detail. I really appreciate it again. It's an honor speaking with you. And is there anything and any final? This is a grand question. It's difficult to answer, but is there any final advice you would like to give for the American high school student today?
Yes, know the history, know the real history, and I certainly appreciate your effort in doing this. For all of the resources that are out there to find the history, the real history, go there. I'm not quite sure where some high school students are right now, but go look at the real history. And I appreciate your effort, Matthew. Good. Okay. Tell your audience to go back and look at their personal histories of their families and what took place during the various periods that we've experienced.
I'll let you go now, and thank you for your time, and it was an absolute pleasure to speak with you.